Okay, good evening everyone and welcome along to this webinar, Getting Started Cray Diving in Sydney with Neil Dorrian. A lot of you already know Neil and may have seen him in our last webinar, but I'm going to just take a minute to introduce him again to you all. So Neil is based here on the northern beaches of Sydney. He has lived and breathed his life in the ocean, starting his career over 25 years ago as a scuba instructor in New Zealand. His true passion has always been in hunting and fishing. Neil started spearing over 30 years ago and has had a huge career in the spear and dive industries here in Australia, writing and teaching the spearfishing courses for SSI. For the last 20 years, he has been representing a range of spearfishing brands, including Esclopaz, Andre, Omar, Spora Sub, Immersion and Cressy. And for more than 15 years, he has been representing Rob Allen. Today, he is the brand manager for AUP, who distributes Rob Allen, Salvamar, Pelagic, Ocean Hunter, and many more brands. We have been really excited about this one, a lot to talk about this one. So thank you so much, Neil, for joining us tonight. I'm going to mute myself and let you get started.
Thanks very much, Carmen. And thanks everybody for attending tonight. Certainly been a wild and woolly sort of few days in Sydney for those of you that are here. And the one good bit of news with that is typically with rougher conditions, we actually get crayfish coming a little bit closer. So we can look forward to maybe a few crayfish around once the seas flatten off in the next few days or few weeks. So that's a bit of a bonus. So look, tonight we're going to be talking mostly around crayfish diving in New South Wales, but feel free to ask questions from further afield. I have done crayfish diving a little bit down in the Mornington Peninsula of Victoria, and certainly a fair bit for southern crays in New Zealand. So tonight we're going to be talking about the species of crayfish around Australia, just a little bit of an insight into the different ones that are around. Won't bore you too much with that. And a little bit about the rules and regulations around crayfish diving here in New South Wales, just in case you're not aware of some of those. We'll talk about the equipment required to be successful with crayfish diving, where and when to look for them, and how best to catch them, give you a little bit of an idea of some of the best techniques around that. And at the end, any questions, I'll try to answer those once we get to the end of it. But Carmen, Olivia will butt in as well if you've got any questions as we go along, if you've got any pertinent questions. So as far as the species of crayfish around Australia, well, they're actually really spiny lobsters rather than crayfish, but we all call them crays. So for simplicity, this evening I'll continue to call them crays. Around New South Wales, the most common cray we have is the eastern rock lobster or crayfish. It's found in New South Wales, also Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, and it's also found in New Zealand, in the northern areas of New Zealand, which they call it the packhorse cray. It's actually, and I only Wikipedia'd it this last night to get a little bit of information on it. I always thought the southern was the biggest cray species, but in fact the eastern is the largest cray and gets up to 15 kilos in size. Now, I've certainly never seen one that's 15 kilos, but I have seen some pretty big ones which are far too big to take. So that's the main one we'll see off Sydney, and in fact it's very rare to get any other species of cray in Sydney, but I have heard the odd story of people getting southern crays. So the southern cray is found in the southern Australia, from sort of Eden southwards, prevalent in Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, and also the main cray, Tasmania, and also the main crayfish they get in New Zealand. It grows up to at least 8 kilos, although I'm sure I've seen bigger than 8 kilos in New Zealand once as well. So they get pretty enormous, quite a sturdy crayfish and really hard to pull out of holes, a lot of fun to catch. Tend to find them often a little bit deeper than you do the easterns as well. In West Australia, they have the western spiny lobster. And that's just found on the west coast in WA. In the tropics, we have crays there as well. Personally, I don't think they're quite as nice to eat as the easterns or the southerns or the westerns, but you have the painted and ornate crays, which are found in our tropical waters, and also found in New South Wales down to probably as far south as Southwest Rocks. I've seen them there. So those are the species of crays we've got here, but tonight we'll primarily talk about the eastern. So as far as some of the rules and regulations of the eastern crayfish that we have off Sydney, first of all, there's a possession limit of only 2 crayfish. So that means not only you can take on the day, but actually in your possession. So if you had 2 at home, well, that's considered in your possession. A lot of people don't really worry about that, but that is the technical law around it. So you're allowed any 2 crays, and that could be a mixture of crays as well, including southerns if you were down further south in New South Wales. What I recommend that you all do is get one of these, which is a cray measuring device available from the Department of Primary Industries. Most stores have these available free of charge, and it is a measuring device which also on one side gives you all the details around your crayfish for local conditions, also gives you all of the details of abalone, of which you're allowed to take 2 as well in New South Wales. So you don't get too much for feed of the good old abalone, but they are actually starting to increase and improve in numbers as well, which is a really good thing. So in New South Wales, like I said, the maximum you can take is 2. The minimum size is 104 millimeters, and it's the carapace, which is the head of the cray that you measure, and that is detailed on the measuring tool, so you can use that. There's also a maximum size, which is 180 millimeter. Very rarely see them up to this size in Sydney, but you do get them from time to time. So if it's larger than 180 mil in the carapace, then you're to let it go. The other very important thing with crays is if they are carrying, or what we call bearing eggs, they're to be let go as well. They carry up to thousands of eggs under their tails, under the flaps of their tails. And it's important, obviously, if they're carrying eggs to let them produce and to repopulate. So just bear that in mind when you catch a cray, to turn it over and to check for eggs. It's pretty obvious. One little side note with the crayfish is that the easy way to tell a male from a female is that the flaps in the back of the tail are large on the female, but also the rear back leg on a female cray actually has 2 claws on it rather than 1, which it uses to scrape the eggs off when it's time to lay those eggs. As far as other details, as far as rules and regulations goes, you do need a license to catch crays in New South Wales. So that's if you are, unless you are under the age of 18 or an Aboriginal or a pensioner. And I'm not quite there yet. Most of you that are Speros would already have a license, but bear in mind that you do need that license if you are going after crays as well. Further details are available in the Department of Primary Industry, DPI's website, and there's plenty of information there. And most stores also carry as much information as they can from the DPI around capturing crayfish. Now, in New South Wales, you can only capture a crayfish by hand, preferably a gloved hand, but only by hand. So you can't use a hook, you can't use a spear, you can't use scuba, you can only snorkel for crays in New South Wales. That does vary from state to state. Certainly in Victoria, you can catch crays on scuba, and you also can in West Australia. So it does vary a little bit from state to state, but that's our rules and regulations here. And I personally think it's quite good and quite a challenge to breath hold for them. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the current regulations as they stand. Although occasionally it would be nice to be able to take a couple more than 2. But those are the rules and regulations as they stand, and they're there for the reason that if we could take too many, then the population would deplete to a level where it wouldn't be sustainable anymore. You can take crayfish by torch, and I do recommend, I'll talk about that a little bit in equipment later on, but I do recommend that you use a torch when going after crayfish. It does make a big difference. I couldn't put it in a percentage, but I would say that you would certainly double the amount of times that you see crays by using a torch. It could even be higher than that. So it's amazing how easily they can hide and you'll look under a ledge with your eyes and then look under it with a torch and you'll see the cray there clearly. So I definitely recommend investing in one of them. You can also dive for crayfish in New South Wales at night. And a lot of people aren't aware of that, but on those really flat nights that we have when the whistly winds are blowing, you can go for crays at night. The limits still apply, can be a little bit spooky, and I wouldn't recommend going out if there's any sea conditions running. But I quite enjoy actually going out for crays at night, and it can be very productive, particularly on a darker moon. I tend to find when there's a full moon, you don't see many crays out at all. You see a lot of octopus. I think the octopus uses it as an opportunity to hunt. But on a dark new moon, you get a heap of crays out when they are in. As far as the equipment goes for cray diving, it's pretty basic really as to what your requirements are. So your basic snorkeling equipment is all you really need. Because in New South Wales and particularly up Sydney, we tend to get most of our crays during the winter months. It is a lot cooler. I tend to use a 5mm open cell wetsuit just because it is cooler and I'm out there for longer periods of time. As I mentioned before, a torch is really important. Just got a couple of simple torches, the little cheap one that we sell. Got a simple magnetic reed sort of switch on the top. And that's all you need. These retail for about $49. And some people invest a little bit more and go for something like this torch here, which is a 1,000 lumen torch. It is rechargeable, more expensive, but a lot brighter, so it can be used for other things like scuba diving, etc. as well, if you're into that. A sturdy pair of gloves is really important. I tend to recommend not necessarily using the same gloves that you use for spearing. If you want to use really gloves that give excellent dexterity for spearfishing, they tend to not be durable enough for cray diving. You will be out there buying new gloves all the time, which is good for us wholesalers and good for the retailers, but it might get a little bit hard on the old hip pocket. So a glove like this one, which has actually got over glue over all the seams. It's a Kevlar palm, and the fingers have actually got Kevlar running right over the top of them, is going to last a lot longer. That's the Ocean Hunter Kevlar Claw. But there's other brands of gloves like that as well. The other option that people sometimes go for is Dyneema, which is quite strong. My thing with Dyneema is you still sometimes feel the sharp barbs of the cray, and you don't get any insulation. So this is my preference. But there are other options out there, but get yourself a good pair of durable gloves for sure. The other thing is a cray bag. So there's a few different types of cray bags. I'll show you the one that I prefer. I often go spearing at the same time. So I use, this is actually a Rob Allen cray bag, and this is designed to actually sit around the hip. So it's got mesh on one side, so it drains quite well. It's got a sturdy backing on the other side, and it just sits around your waist, and the edge of it sits around your hip. So I'll sort of show you here, sort of goes around your hip like so, and it's large enough to fit your two crays in it for New South Wales. It's a little bit small for some of the bigger southerns that you get down in the Mornington Peninsula, but you know, really good to use, and enables you to spear unencumbered at the same time. So it's what I prefer to use. It's not great if you are adding a lot of other things to it. So if you had a heap of scallops and abalone or whatever into it as well, it can get a little bit heavy to dive with. But just for a couple of crayfish, I find it the best to use. But I do have friends that tend to prefer this one, and this is a inexpensive mesh bag from Rob Allen, and these can either be put up your wetsuit and pulled out when you find crays, or rolled up and attached to your float if you're spearing as well. So that's another good option. And if you are in other markets, this little baby here, or big Tex Bag, I should call it the the Optimist because it's such a big cray bag, but that's designed for, you know, big southern crays. It's got a zipper on the bottom of it. It's mesh. It's great for scallops and other stuff as well. For New South Wales, it's probably a little bit on the large size, but if you are confident you're going to get a couple of good sized crays, then it's going to work well. But it is very popular in West Australia and South Australia and Victoria and places like that, where they tend to get a heap of other shellfish at the same time. Let's make sure I covered everything as far as the equipment goes. Yeah, as far as the wetsuit goes, when I'm diving for crays, and I'm going to get into the sort of technique and where you dive a little bit further down the track, but you are often diving in shallow water, and you don't. I tend to want to wear slightly more weight than what I'm wearing when I'm free diving or spearfishing. So I wear another 3 pounds or about 1.4 kilo of weight, just so I find it easy to dive down and stay down, where when I'm diving deeper for spearfishing, you know, I want to be a little bit positively buoyant on the surface for safety reasons. But for spearfishing, because it's only quite shallow, I tend to want to dive a little bit heavier. So give that a go. I think you'll find it a little bit easier to duck dive and in those sort of shallower conditions with a little bit more weight on. So where to get crays? Well, I guess it's the important question. You can get crays all year round in Sydney. A lot of people say you only get them in winter and you only get them from Father's Day onwards and that sort of stuff, but I've certainly found crayfish all year round in Sydney. Certainly further down the coast and further up the coast from Sydney, you get them more consistently. But you will, if you put the effort and time in, you will get them, you'll find crays all year round. But what you tend to find is that the crayfish are, you know, sort of on the continental shelf in numbers, and they move in closer during the sort of winter periods. And I tend to find late winter, early spring is when they tend to move into quite shallow areas. And in fact, in New South Wales or in Sydney at that time, I tend not to find many females ever carrying eggs. So it doesn't seem to ever be an issue that you need to be so aware of with the crays that march in. So during that time, you tend to find them in really, really shallow type areas. So look for days when you get westerly winds blowing, which is quite common over that sort of winter and early September periods. And when the sea's completely calm, and that's when you'll get some of your best conditions for going out and looking around for crays. So crays love areas where there's vertical cracks in the rocks. So cracks that are running down this way is a great area where you'll find crays. They like tight little holes, and often you'll find what we call nests of crays. So large number of crays in a hole. And when you get nests of crays, what you tend to find is that the larger crays push the smaller crays forward. So you'll see all the little ones forward in the hole, and the bigger ones are often behind them. So they're actually quite hard to catch when they're in that situation. When I'm looking for crays in a new area, I tend to look for country where there's a lot of kanji, because crays actually eat kanji. And so the minute I find a fair bit of kanji, I start to look a little bit more closely. Areas where there's lots of cracks in the rocks, holes where they can hide, are all sort of typical telltale signs that crays will be around. And if you've got an area where there's a bommy that's close to shore and the waves can sort of break over the bommy, I tend to find in behind the bommy is often a really good area for crays. But you'll find crays on all of the headlands, all of the reef systems, and smaller sort of barren spots where you wouldn't necessarily go for spearfishing. And even in the harbour, you find crays during the winter months. So they're pretty much around all reef areas. It's just a matter of spending the time and looking in relatively shallow areas. Now, obviously they do come from the deep, but I tend to get the best results in shallow water. And what I mean by shallow is pretty much right in that surf zone. So if it's wavy and it's big swell like it's been this week, you've got no hope of getting those crayfish. So you've got to wait for the right conditions, for the flat seas, to be able to swim into those areas where you'll get good numbers of crayfish. One other little thing I've noticed with crayfish is that they do, particularly if there's a nest of them, they do often have wobbegongs around them. So if you see a wobbegong, pay attention to what's behind the wobby. You'll often find crayfish around them, and also eels tend to frequent the same holes. And the reason is, I think it's a little bit of a symbiotic relationship between the crays and the eels and wobbies, because the biggest predator on crayfish is octopus. And obviously octopus go and look for the cray, and the wobby or the eel eats the octopus. So it works pretty well for them with that regard. So once you've found the cray, I guess that the next thing is having to catch it, and that's I think the most challenging part of it all, because you look at a crayfish and you'd expect that they wouldn't move very quickly, but they actually do move relatively quickly. So you need to sort of be prepared to grab them. What I try to do, if I've got a good breath on me and I'm not partway through my breath hold, then I'll try to get the cray there and then, the minute I see it. If you are working at a buddy pair, which I suggest is a good idea, that helps as well. That way I'd come to the surface and tell my buddy that there's crays there and work a strategy to get them. Generally, in most holes, unless it's a vertical crack, the cray has an exit hole. And if there's a number of crays in there, you've got to be prepared to block that exit hole. Now, I didn't mention before, but with spear fishing, obviously you're not allowed to spear the cray, but you're actually not allowed to spear with a torch either. So it's a little bit of a dilemma of what to do with that. I often do have a spear going with me, so I'm not sure if it's really breaking the rules. I never use it to actually spear the fish. But if I'm by myself, sometimes I'll just place the tip of the spear in the exit hole, unloaded of course, and the crays then won't back out past the spear gun, and that will enable me to grab the crays out of the hole. They just never will swim out past the block that you've made for whatever reason, and that works quite well. So that's one technique you can do, or get your buddy to block one side of the hole and you go and from one side. Generally, your buddy will get the best result because they'll back out straight into their hands. Now, with a crayfish, obviously they've got the feelers, which will normally be facing towards you as you go to grab them. So what I try to do is sort of lunge forward, and if you've got space to kick, then kick or push your knee at the same time. So you're lunging towards the cray, try and grab it by the horns. So not the actual antennae, which will break, but the horns that are behind them, and pull the cray out that way. Sometimes they will really hold on extremely hard to rock, and they're in a really tight area. If they're in that sort of situation, what I try to do, if I can grab them with two hands, is actually push the cray backwards rather than forwards. And that one tends to loosen their hold. You can wriggle them, but generally if you can get two hands on the horns, you will be able to get them out. But often they're quite tight little holes, and you can only hold on to them with the one hand. And with that situation, I try to push in and out and wriggle the cray to be able to pull it out. Once you've actually got it out of the hole, make sure you really hold on to those horns tightly, because what tends to happen then is they snap their tail, and sometimes they can break loose again, and you've lost the cray, which happened the last time I went out for crays. I lost the cray that I had. So that does happen from time to time. I think I mentioned already around the areas where you go, if you find a single cray, I often find that there are others around it. So if you find one cray in a crack, spend a fair bit of time around that general area. 9 times out of 10, there will be other crays around that area. I sometimes find if there's a big nest of crays, they're often actually smaller crays than there, but there'll sometimes be big crays that are nearby. So be aware of that. As I already mentioned, try to work in pairs as much as possible. I tend to just cover as much area as I can, breathe up, go down, swim around, look under as many crays, holes, cracks as I can, use the torch in all of those overhangs, all of those holes, and you'll get much better results. You'll find that it can be a little bit challenging if there is a little bit of sea, because you do have to work in relatively shallow water to get the best results. So just be cautious around swell in areas that you dive. There's been plenty of instances where people have been swept into gutters and lost fins and masts and stuff like that. So be cautious and err on the side of safety. If the conditions don't allow and it's too rough, you can always go for crays in the harbour. There are closures within the harbour as well that you need to be aware of. There's the North Harbour Reserve, which you can't get crays in, but there's plenty of other areas that you can in Sydney Harbour, Broken Bay, etc. So I think that's really the majority of the information around catching crays in New South Wales or off Sydney. I'll maybe open up for questions now if any of you guys have got any questions.
Yep, great, thanks Neil, that's awesome. So I've had a couple of questions here and they've just asked me to ask them if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is from Jason Harris, and he said he's consistently finding baby cray nests but nothing close to legal. Should he continue searching harder in the general area or just look for new ground?
Yeah, look, it's sometimes the time of year. So at this time of year and through the summer, I often find that you do get a lot of nests of undersized crays. That's not uncommon. It is a good sign that the crays frequent the area, and I think you'll find if you go back to those same spots in late winter, beginning of September, that you'll have the bigger crays around that same area. So you're looking in the right area. It's just that the larger crays aren't in at the moment.
Cool. Jason, that answer your question? Yep, thanks so much. The next one is Jesse, and you touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can touch a bit more. He wants the best advice on night diving for crays. So you sort of touched on a little bit there, but... Yeah,
so night diving for crays, as I mentioned, I actually quite enjoy it. It's quite relaxing if you've got the right sort of conditions. So I tend to look for a darker moon phase, so not full moon. It's a massive difference, the amount of crays that are out on a dark moon compared to, or a new moon compared to a full moon. In fact, I would say on a full moon, it's almost like going for crays in the day. The crays just aren't out. New moon, certainly not full, and a decent torch and a backup torch, because if you're out there and one torch goes, then it's a bit can be a bit frightening heading on back on in. I find that they are often out on congee at night, eating congee, and a brighter torch is actually quite good. And I tend to not use the traditional technique of grabbing the cray by the horns, but I basically put the light in front of them and grab them by the carapace. But it can be, really, really, successful way to go after crays.
Awesome. And Nicholas has actually just asked, Nick Gums just asked if there's any particular time at night.
Oh, look, I've been at all times of night, and even gone out snapper fishing and jumped in after midnight and been successful. So, no, I think once the sun's down, they start to come out. I'll probably give it a couple of hours for them to come out to the reef completely, but I've always just left a couple of hours and been quite successful on a darker moon phase.
Awesome. Who else have I got here? Sorry, guys, just one second. I've got, so A few of you just going off here, which is great. So Nick, I'll just stick on night diving for a second, guys, and then I'll come back to the other questions about slippers. So he said when you shine the torch on them, they hide deeper into the cave. Do you need to grab them really quickly after spotting them?
That's, we talking during the day?
Night, when you shine the torch on them.
Oh no, they don't tend to move really. I tend to find that they just sit on the kunji and I mean, I don't muck around, but to see how long they'll wait. But generally, I just shine the torch on them, go straight down, and grab them by the carapace. So they're looking at the torch, possibly blinded by the torch, and grabbing them by the carapace part of the shell.
Perfect. I'm just going to I'll ask one more on behalf of a couple of them. So Jason and Chris, and then I'll start letting other people ask the questions. But Jason and Chris have just asked about any tips on finding slipper crays.
Yeah, so I certainly wouldn't call myself a master with slipper crays. I'm fairly certain that slipper crays, you can actually add that to your limit. So you can, I think it was 10 for Balmain bug. I don't know if slipper lobster is the same, but a lot of people do add it to the limit, and typically they are on the roof of the cave. So don't look down, look up, because they're just about always up on the roof of the cave. They do like overhangs, they do like similar sort of areas, but probably more frequently in areas where there's a big overhang, where I tend to find easterns, you don't get as many of them in big overhangs. In southerns, I find you'll get a lot of southern crays in deep overhangs, but easterns tend to be more in vertical cracks or in tighter holes than southerns, and tighter holes than slippers.
Awesome. Hopefully I'm going to catch everyone here. Perry, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to? You can just unmute yourself, mate. Me, that's okay. Do tides matter? High or low tide? What's best?
Look, high tide is just easier to access some of the tidal locations, because at low tide, I mean, sometimes the crays are in, half a metre or less of water at high tide. So at low tide, there can be, next to no water on them. So high tide makes it easier, but it doesn't really matter. I don't tend to look at the tides too much when I go for them, but it certainly is easier to get them if the seas are flat and it's high tide.
Perfect.
So looking back to the slipper question, Chris Smith asked if you're allowed to combine the lobsters on top of the slippers.
Yeah, I think you are, but you just, I'm not 100%. When I've been out, I have done that, and I've been told that's the case, but I'm not 100% sure, and the rules with the DPI do change, so just double check on that, but I'm fairly certain that is the case still. But it's not the case with southerns and with easterns, it's a combined total.
Awesome. And the next one is, sorry, I'm just kind of just
asking if there are any good fish to take during winter whilst looking for crays. He says it sounds like they're in the same locations as the ludric. Yeah,
a ludric, drummer, bream to a certain extent are all in those locations. And because you're sort of, the best time is around that sort of September, early October, as far as consistent results off Sydney. I mean, certainly further up the coast and down the coast, they get a lot more consistent numbers than we do. But Sydney, I tend to find that's definitely the best time of the year. That also coincides with the migration of the kingfish back down the coast in quite shallow, and they come in right along the headlands and in right shallow water as well. So sometimes, you're going after crays, and dirty grappling kingy will rock up. I tend to sometimes not take my spear gun at all if I'm focusing just on crays, although I did that recently, and a couple of guys wanted past with jewfish, which is pretty uncommon in the northern beaches nowadays, so I was kicking myself that day. But there are times when it's easier just to focus on the one thing. When they were on in that sort of September period, I generally have my gun with me as well, just in case a big kingy or something like that rocks up.
Awesome. And next one, do you get abalone in the space spots from Nick Gum?
Sorry?
Do you get abalone in the space spots?
In the same spot? Oh, same spots. Yeah, for sure. You know, there seems to be a lot of abalone around at the moment. And last time I went out, I saw a heap of them. I didn't bother grabbing them. I get a little bit frustrated with the limit. With 2, I would rather be able to take more and do it less frequently. But that's the limit, so I don't bother taking 2. But yeah, very common that you'll get abalone in the same areas for sure.
Awesome. And
just quickly, Neil, do you find that spending a little bit of time to try and bait crays out to get them sort of towards the front of the crack, do you find that that's worthwhile?
I've never tried it. I've heard all sorts of different tricks like that of baiting and of putting an octopus in the hole and the cray scurry out. The only thing that I've used, which I guess you could call it controversial, but it's certainly not illegal, is with an unloaded spear gun rattling that in a cave. And in the end, they just get sick of the commotion and they move out. That can work quite effectively if you get the right type of cave. I have heard of people having success with baiting them, but I've never bothered doing that.
awesome. And Ian has asked how deep, like in what kind of depth of water do you usually find them?
Well, so in that sort of September period, they are really shallow, but you know, you can still find them, you know, down to 10 metres, and they obviously do march on in. So there's nothing for scuba divers to find them in 20 or 30 metres of water. The biggest eastern I ever caught or saw was on a scuba dive in about 25 metres of water, and it was an absolute monster. It wasn't 15 kilos, but it would have been, you know, maybe 10 kilos. It was a really big cray. So they march on in, but I tend to focus on them in probably that first 4 or 5 metres of water in the time of year where you most frequently find them is in those shallow spots.
Awesome. And Stephen's asked your best spots for crayfish in New South Wales. You know, I'm not going to give those up.
No. Look, I mostly go to northern beaches, and you know there's plenty of good spots, but most people, when they've got a good spot, tend not to want to pass them on. But you know, whether it be Mona Vale, Narrabeen, there's some areas that you can't. They've got the intertidal zones, so you've got to be a little bit careful of those. It's not the same areas that you can get crays, that you can get that you can spear fish. So be aware of that. For instance, Longreef is a intertidal zone where you can't get crayfish unless, I think it's 100 metres offshore there. And there is some reef 100 metres offshore, and if you're on a boat, you could do that. But so be aware of those rules and regulations. But I think just put the time in. And like I said, it's not any headland, it's basically any reef structure. And, you know, just swim along and look for those areas like Kunji that I was telling you about. Look for feelers, use a torch. You know, you often don't see the feelers necessarily first up. Everyone thinks that the feelers will be the obvious giveaway, but there are numerous times where I'll look in a hole and the cray's got its antenna facing backwards. So I don't necessarily think that they're always going to be forward in that sort of defensive position, which they normally have them out that way, sort of feeling for food and for defence, etc. But I often find in tight cracks that they actually pull the antenna back and behind them. So that's where the torch is invaluable. You sometimes find them in areas, sometimes where in areas where I'm looking hard and I believe that there's crays around. I've actually found them in weed. in seagrass and in weed, actually up out of the cracks. And I don't know whether that's just that they're preparing to move, but I've noticed that a fair bit down the south coast, that they're not in necessarily the same haunts that I'd see them in Sydney, but just in the weed itself.
Awesome. I've just had a couple of private questions. If you can just repeat the legal size and also what to do if they have eggs as well.
So the legal size for Easterns is 104, where is it here? 104 mil, or 10.4 centimeters, and the maximum is 18. And sorry, did you ask about the eggs?
Yes, what to do if they have eggs.
So if they've got eggs, just release them straight away. So just turn them over. If they're carrying eggs, then release them. Now, in saying that, I've hardly ever seen a cray off Sydney that's carrying eggs. Sometimes I find them when they're soft, because they actually pull in water into their shell when they're about to shed their shell, so they become soft. That's not illegal to catch them in New South Wales when they're soft. I don't think they're as nice to eat when they are soft, but you can catch them like that. In New Zealand, if they're soft, you can't take them. I'm not sure what those rules are in the other states.
Awesome. And the next, sorry, I'm going back and forth a little bit here. Do crays come back to the same holes throughout the year?
Yeah, they do, definitely. So if you find a nest, you'll generally get crays there on a regular basis. And even from week, because we've got quite a bit of pressure in Sydney, when it's flat, you'll see a cray hole that's normally got crays with nothing in it, but then the next time there's a bit of swell or whatever, they'll come back. So yeah, I've got usual holes, which are a really good indicator for me. If I go to a reef and look in those normal holes and there's no crays, then I generally sort of almost give up, because there's just some holes that are really consistent that hold good numbers. And sometimes those are holes where you actually can't get the crays out, but it just gives you a really good indicator that the crays are in, and it's time to hunt a bit harder.
Awesome. We've just had a couple of also said check the app, and that the eastern southern lobsters are combined bag limit of 2, but slippers are an extra 2 in their own bag limit.
Awesome.
John and David, I think you put the same. Thank you so much. Where are we at? Let's see. Have we got any more questions here? Oh, Liv, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question? No? Then I'm going to keep going. Okay. So Nick has asked, have you found that after you catch crays and put them in a bag, it'll attract large stingrays?
What was that? Sorry.
Guys, I feel like some of you should unmute yourselves on these. Okay, have you found that crays tend to attract stingrays?
No, I haven't.
All right.
I have seen stingrays around when I've got crays, but I just think they're always around. So I haven't found that they're chasing you out of the water or anything when you've got your crays in the bag. I tend to find that nothing. If you break off a leg or whatever, the old moray eels can be a little bit of an issue. In fact, when I went out with my mate the other day for crays, there was a moray eel in the hole, quite a large moray eel, and I was rather nervous to try to pull it out. In fact, stuffed the cray up because I think I was too worried about the eel that was in there. So yeah, you do need to be a little bit cautious and just don't shove your hand in any hole where there is a cray without checking for eels and wobbegongs, etc. In that case, I mean, the eel was probably more frightened than I was, and it took off, wrapped itself around my arm and took off. But no, it was just gaining the courage to chuck your hand in there initially. It took me a little while.
Sounds like me with the shaft last week and the moray eel. That was fun. Okay, cool.
I just did see a question then around what to do after you catch the crays, and I tend to put them into my fridge, and it sort of it doesn't completely kill them, but sort of anesthetizes them, or I don't know what you call it, but And some people put them in freezers as well to kill them quickly before they actually cook them. And generally, when I cook them, if I'm just boiling, I go like a formula of boiling hot water, a big pot of it, plenty of salt in it. Even if it's ocean salt water, it's even better. And I do 10 minutes per kilo to cook it complete. Now, sometimes the crays in Sydney aren't necessarily a kilo in weight.
And somebody was asking a question about clicking before. I can't seem to find the question. I'm going to keep looking for that and come back to it. And
can you locate the crays through hearing them clicking? Was from Sam Smith.
Can you hear them clicking?
Yeah.
You hear all sorts of sounds under there, and I'm sure that there is the sound of them moving around, but I don't listen for sounds when I'm targeting crayfish. It's more just diving plenty, looking under obvious spots, covering a bit of territory, and sort of once you get to have your common spots, just frequenting them. But I don't tend to listen for any sort of sounds of them.
Awesome. And there's been a couple of questions about the best way to store crays and also how long you can keep them in the fridge or freezer for.
Yeah, look, I'm no expert on keeping them in the fridge. They don't hang around that long when I've got them. But, it's seafood, so you just have to follow sort of general seafood recommendations, cook seafood. I wouldn't get carried away with hanging around too long. They can be frozen, so after they're cooked and thawed back out and eaten that way as well. But like any seafood, fresh is best for sure. And I'm no chef. I tend to keep it pretty basic on the old craze, but there's certainly some fantastic dishes out there that people do use with it. Where they pull out the tail and pull out the meat and cook it a variety of different ways. But generally, I just use the good old boil technique, sometimes Mornay and that sort of stuff as well. It's sort of not you're not talking to a chef from when it comes to me as far as the different ways of cooking. But I would just err on the side of caution as far as storing it and leave it in the fridge. I've certainly left it in the fridge for a couple of days before cooking with no problems at all.
Perfect. And there's been a question about any good spots around Avalon.
Yeah, heaps of good spots around Avalon. Mona Vale is probably one of the more popular spots as well. All of those headlands and reefs that head in from headlands up there all hold crayfish and regular numbers. All of those northern beaches areas, further north, hold crays really consistently. Same as further south of northern beaches, though, you still find that sort of end of winter, early spring does give you the best results.
Neil, you mentioned bommies just off headlands and stuff.
Yeah.
You normally find the crays on the protected side of the reefs or the exposed side of the bomb?
I've heard theories of both, but I always find on the protected side, it's really, really good. So I think maybe because the crays aren't getting battered around as much, you still need to. Obviously, they still need to have decent cracks and decent areas to. If there's a vertical crack or something behind a bommy and it's close to the shore edge, just about guarantee that there'll be crays there. Particularly if there's kanji and stuff like that around, it's just to me a perfect spot to look for crays.
Terrific.
Awesome. There's just been a question about the swells. Will the crays be out more because of the swells this last week?
Will
there be more crays out because of the swells last week?
Yeah, I think so for sure. I don't know the reason why. It doesn't really make sense to me that you get crays that move more with swell closer to shore, but they do for sure. I mean, I've had instances where I've gone out for spearing around Christmas just off freshwater headland, and come back in, and there's just been a heap of crays that I just swam over, and ended up grabbing a couple, of course, but and I couldn't believe how many there were around. That was after a big period of swell. So I often find big swell like we've just had, there's going to be crays around after this for sure. I just about guarantee it.
Awesome. Is there any more questions? Does anybody want to take a minute to ask a question themselves? Now we've fired those at Neil. Sorry about that, Neil.
I do have one other technique. I've got a mate of mine, I won't mention his name, he has been on looking at the thing tonight though, and he actually always finds a lot of crays around crayfish pots. So I don't know how that quite pans out, but I do always say to him that I guess with crayfish pots, the crayfishermen know their stuff, so they're obviously putting their pots around where crays are. But please be cautious not to ever get caught with your hand in a crayfish pot, because some of those crayfishermen are pretty big and burly, and I would not want to take the risk. But yeah, they know their stuff, the crayfishermen. So if you see crayfish pots around in Sydney, just about guarantee that the crayfish are around, because they don't muck around putting pots out for no reason.
Neil, what's the anecdotal evidence as far as recovery of numbers of the eastern crayfish lobster? Like they were hammered there for a number of years, weren't they?
Yeah, look, they were, as all of the fish species have been in New South Wales. And look, I don't know if there's any proof that the numbers are really improving. You know, I would like to see more policing of our waters by fisheries to check limits and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say that they are on the increase or decline. I tend to find it varies a lot from year to year how many come in close. But I have noticed over the last few years that there's certainly less crayfish pots out. So whether the licenses have been purchased on the northern beaches and the guys just aren't fishing it, or the numbers have declined to a level that they don't bother off Sydney anymore. I mean, we've obviously got all of us looking for crays, so there's a lot more people catching crays on the north, around Sydney as well. So we all take our toll. But you know, I think two's certainly a fair limit. I wouldn't want it to get any less than that. So then it just comes down to the commercial aspect of it, and obviously the DPI scientists, etc., looking into ensure the sustainability of it. But to me, the big thing that I see missing, and this is across all fishery, is the compliance aspect. You know, you just never get checked. And as a result of never getting checked, there's going to be those people that break the rules and don't get caught. Where, you know, I think in places like New Zealand, there's a lot more compliance, and certainly in Victoria there is as well, to ensure the sustainability of the species.
Awesome. And Andrew K, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so the question was, do you mainly find crays when you set inside the harbour? Is it on the kind of beaches and headlands that face the heads, or do you find them a bit further up as well?
I find them a fair way in the harbour, but on areas that do sort of face towards the heads, but surprisingly long way in. I mean, I know you're ridiculously up towards the harbour bridge or anything like that, but yeah, there's surprising during certain times of year that there's good numbers there. I tend not to focus so much on the harbour for crays, but people do get really good results in the harbour for sure.
Awesome. Is there any last questions out there? Jasper, you can unmute and ask. Nice to see you in here. Jasper?
Hey, I was going to ask, do you reckon there's more crays that come in closer after there's a period of swell like at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that question was asked before, and I've said before, I'm not sure why that's the case. There's probably some scientific reason, but yeah, definitely. I used to think maybe it was just that they got pushed out of the deeper holes and things that they were in the reef, so we could see them more. But apparently it's more that they get pushed in with the water movement. It's just an indication for them to move into shallower. But yeah, very commonly after big swell, it's a good time to look for crays.
Awesome.
Do you know much, apart from kanji, Neil, do you know much else of what they eat? Like,
yeah, well, they're just scavengers of the ocean, really. They're just giant insects, really. So they'll eat any dead debris, fish, that sort of stuff that's lying around. So they basically just go out there and scavenge and find whatever they can to eat. So whether it be shellfish, abalone, dead fish, dead cuttlefish, all that sort of stuff they'll eat.
Awesome. Guys, last questions, I think. If anyone has any last questions, just let us know. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Excuse me, Neil, just a quick question. If you, just with like thin neoprene gloves, would you typically get spiked? I've never really gone crane before through your gloves at all, if they're not Kevlar protected.
Oh yeah, look, you can use your normal gloves, there's no problems at all. It's just that they wear out quite quickly if you're targeting crays, because the stitching's exposed, the spikes of the cray grab the stitch and then they break the stitch, and then before you know it, your glove's falling apart. Back in the day when I went for crays in New Zealand, we used to actually put aqua seal on all the fingertips and a little bit of sand for grip from new, because we used to go for a lot of crays over there and wear through gloves really, really quickly. So there's lots of things that you can use to increase the strength of the glove. The one I use is a commercial one that I sell, and it's a really good glove, but there's plenty of other alternatives as well.
So you don't actually get spiked with the Craze spikes?
No, not really. I mean, they can still spike through that material, but it's pretty strong. So big southerns and stuff like that I always say big southerns because they tend to, down in the Mornington Peninsula and places like that where I've got them, and in New Zealand they do get quite big, and those guys can almost cut through anything. But the Easterns that we get locally, with the gloves that I use, they tend to hold up to that pretty well.
Okay. Cool, thanks.
I do find when you get cuts with crays that your hands get really sore from it. You can hardly make a fist the next day. So I don't know what it is that's the toxins in all of those spines, but it doesn't swell up, but it just seems to make the hand really, really stiff afterwards. So I used to notice that a lot, particularly with die for crays in New Zealand.
Be bacteria on the outer shell.
Yeah, right.
So who's that?
Bacteria on the outer shell, it's like fish spikes and stuff. They got slime on the outside, and once it punches the skin, that slime's going to have bacteria on it. So once it gets in under the skin, you got your infection and it swells up.
Yeah, right.
There you go. Thanks for that, David.
Been through that.
Thank you. Do we have any last questions? Last chance, everybody.
I got a question. Is there an actual way that you can brain a cray, or do you have to put him in ice?
You mean kill it?
Yeah, just brain it with a knife.
Yeah, I think. I never have, but there are people that do kill them. I think they push the knife down through the sort of top of the head. So there is definitely a way. I'm not 100%. I always take them and try not to sort of put too many holes through the shell itself, because I like to eat the mustard, and I find that when you boil the head, if there's too many holes in it, that all sort of gets gooey and not as nice to eat. So I always use the mustard of the head with the flesh of the crayfish, with the tail when I'm eating it. But I think there is definitely a way that you can do that.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Any last questions at all? Last chance? No, I think we're about done. Well, thank you so much, Neil, for joining us. That was just awesome and really interesting. And we really hammered you with some great questions there. So
Yeah. No, it's good. Well, thanks, guys, for listening, and hopefully I get to see you out there at some stage. And happy hunting. Good luck, and try to get out when these seas flatten off the next few days.